So what month is it right now? It's March. This is fantastic. The weather outside is absolutely beautiful. I want to thank the PCA for having me. It's an honor to be here. This is my 10th show, so it's a real honor to represent the state of Connecticut and share a little bit about what I've learned about the state of Connecticut and cigar tobacco and its influence on the cigar world. So if everybody's ready, let's get it going, and hopefully at the end we can do some Q&A and answer some questions. So just a little background about myself. I was born in Connecticut, in New Haven, Connecticut, and I, like many, was influenced about the love of cigars via my grandfathers. So my grandfathers both smoked Connecticut cigars since I could remember. And the first time smoking a cigar with my grandfather was really a life-changing experience for me. It was a coming of age. By the time I was 18 years old, I had learned everything I could about cigar tobacco. And being from Connecticut, as you know, growing up in your state, Connecticut wasn't so cool growing up until I learned about the history of cigar tobacco. That was one of the coolest things about the state of Connecticut, and also we got great basketball and great pizza. Those are the three top things for Connecticut. I started working a tobacco shop at the age of 18. It was called the Calabash Shop in Hamden, Connecticut. And I worked for two amazing women in Hamden, Connecticut, who gave me my first opportunity, and that was 1996. This was the height of what we call the cigar boom. So by that time, there's the second slide. Unbelievable. So by 1996, I learned everything I possibly could. So just so you guys know, the top picture on the left is my grandfather, Pasquale. That is a picture from World War II. He was an avid Connecticut broadleaf smoker. That picture is him doing the proper thing with a Nazi flag. He's sticking it up his buttocks. I never got to smoke a cigar with Pasquale, but he is really someone that I've dreamed about sharing a cigar with. Hopefully, you know, one day in the next life we can share a cigar together. But that's the cigar that you guys have at your tables right now. I released a special Charter Oak under the name of Pasquale. That is a Connecticut broadleaf wrapper, and it's Nicaraguan binder and filler. So we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. I hope you guys enjoy it through the presentation. Right is a young Nick Mellilio working at the Calabash Shop. And on the left is my other grandfather, Pegnatero. That is Christmas 1996, and we're all smoking Opus X #2 torpedoes. That was really one of the moments that really changed my life and really put me in the direction of handmade cigars. I apologize. So by the age of 18, I learned everything I could. I went to college, traveled the world, and I really didn't understand the importance of Connecticut in the cigar world until I moved to Esteli, Nicaragua in 2003. That was really, you know, speaking to many ex-Cuban pats, many Nicaraguan cigar makers, meeting them for the first time. ¿De dónde eres? Where are you from? Connecticut. That's where I start to really see the reverence for Connecticut and Connecticut tobacco in the cigar world. Here I was, 24, in the north of Nicaragua, among some of the most amazing legends in the cigar world, and the reverence and knowledge about Connecticut tobacco was really unprecedented. I'm gonna go through just a very brief history of tobacco, and then we're gonna get really focus in on the history of Connecticut and focus in on the three major seed varieties that are grown in Connecticut. Tobacco goes back 2.5 million years. That is a picture of the first fossilized tobacco found in Peru. Okay, this was found by a Dutch archaeologist who also discovered the saber-toothed tiger. He discovered fossilized tobacco. This is a very interesting period of time because it was the beginning of what we call the Pleistocene era. The Pleistocene era was the beginning of the ebb and flows of ice ages. So from 2.5 million years to about 15,000 years, ice ages ebbed and flowed over time, up until the last ice age about 15,000 years ago. We're really learning about tobacco. We don't know much about it between that period of time until the last ice age. Something very interesting happened recently. This year, there was actually a site in Utah that found tobacco seeds on a site that dated 14,000 years ago. You're looking at microscopic image of tobacco seeds. If anybody's seen tobacco seeds, very small, they're like a grain of sand. So those are actually the seeds that were found on that site. And this has kind of changed our view of when tobacco was really used, about 14,000 years ago. Okay, so we don't really understand exactly how tobacco really got to Connecticut or how long it's been used in Connecticut. What we do know is this last ice age period. So Connecticut is a Mohegan word which means along the great tidal river. And we're gonna focus in on that river because it's because of this river which makes it one of the premier tobacco growing, black tobacco, cigar tobacco growing regions in the world. So Connecticut, named after the Connecticut River, which is about 410 miles long. A little video I'll narrate for you guys. So, Brandon, when you can. Okay, so this is an image of the Connecticut River today, okay? We're gonna go back about 15,000 years ago. This was an ice sheet. This ice sheet extended down to about Long Island. The shoreline extended another 50 miles. That's the green line where you can see the blue, that's the ocean. This ice sheet was so heavy that it started to weigh on the central part of where the valley is today. As it began to recede, it began to leave what we know as today as Lake Hitchcock. And you'll be seeing that there in a moment. So as the glacier recedes, you can see the lake being formed there. That is where the Connecticut River Valley is today. Okay? Lake Hitchcock, about 15,000 years ago, settled in about 30,000 acres in what we know as the Connecticut River Valley today. Okay, so that was Lake Hitchcock. In Rockyville, it was actually plugged up for a few thousand years, and then it broke free and drained into the Long Island Sound and left the Connecticut River Delta. Isn't that amazing? I get off on ice ages, if you can tell. Okay, so here we have Lake Hitchcock. So what happened is the lake bed settled in this 30,000 acres, and the lake bed left the perfect sandy loam soil for growing cigar tobacco. Okay, this whole area, what you're seeing is where all the cigar growing farms are today. Okay, so just to reiterate, we really don't know exactly the time period of when tobacco came into Connecticut. We think what happened was after the glacier receded, that these seeds came up with indigenous tribes and came into the Connecticut region after the last ice age, but it's unclear whether tobacco existed in the area, you know, back as far as 2 million years ago. The strands that existed in Connecticut at the time were mainly strands called Nicotina rustica. Nicotina rustica was a wild tobacco plant. That is the plant on the left, okay? What we consume as cigar smokers is the nicotinum tabacum, which is on your right, okay? It's a different plant structure. The rustica is much smaller plant, much smaller leaves, and the nicotine content in Nicotina rustica is about 10 to 12 times higher. Has anybody ever smoked Nicotina rustica in here? Oh my gosh. Okay, I smoked Nicotina rustica a few times. My first time was in Vietnam. I was heading to Hanoi. I stopped on the side of the road to use the restroom, and there was 3 gentlemen smoking a bamboo water pipe. And it didn't smell like the lyrical Chiba Chiba, that other leaf. It smelled like tobacco. So I showed interest, and these gentlemen handed me the pipe, the bamboo water pipe, with a grin on their faces, and I proceeded to light it up, and I fell down on the back of my feet. I literally almost collapsed, and my head was spinning, and at that point, I kind of realized why the indigenous shaman used rustica, right? The potency in the nicotine is what was used to really communicate with the spirit world. These strands were a bit too much for the Europeans that began to settle Connecticut in the 1600s. So early 1600s, Dutch traders navigate up the Connecticut River. A gentleman by the name of Adrian Block. Anyone familiar with Long Island Sound? Block Island is named after this gentleman. He began trading tobacco for the first time up and down the Connecticut River. This is where it really began. Okay. Windsor is right on the heart of the Connecticut River, and was one of the first places that started growing cigar tobacco. What was happening at the time was, because the rustica strands were so intense, they started hybridizing these seeds with different seeds that were being traded from the Caribbean, Cuba, Virginia, to make them a bit less potent. Otherwise people would be falling on the ground all the time. So these seeds started hybridizing rustica seeds with Nicotina tabacum seeds, and they started growing in Windsor, Connecticut, right in the valley. They were so fertile because of the lake bed of Lake Hitchcock. It left these perfect meadows for growing black tobacco, cigar tobaccos. So throughout the 1600s through 1700s, there was a gentleman by the name of General Putnam, who was said to bring some of the first Cuban seeds in the early 1700s to Connecticut. Mainly, the cigar industry in the 1700s was a cottage industry. For the most part, right? People made cigars on their homesteads, on their farms. It wasn't until we get to the late 1700s and early 1800s that the first cigar factory in the United States was built in 1810 in Suffield, Connecticut. I had the pleasure, I worked closely with Abdel Fernandez from AJ Fernandez. He came up to Connecticut. That is actually a picture of us at the site of where the first cigar factory was in Suffield, Connecticut. It's not there anymore, but the Cigar Association of 1930 erected this stone memorial for the cigar factory. Okay, so to the early 1900s, we're going to get into the seeds that were being grown in Connecticut. You had something interesting that started in the early 1900s. You had the invention of the cigarette machine, right? So you had a lot of tobacco being grown. It started to dip a little bit with the invention of the cigarette machine, leading up until kind of World War II. as you know, a lot of the troops at the time were given cigarettes in their packs, but Connecticut remained kind of a powerhouse of cigar production in New Haven, Connecticut, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in Hartford, Connecticut, and these factories mainly were making cigars using Cuban filler, right? The relationship between Connecticut and Cuba goes back hundreds of years, and the manufacturing of cigars in Connecticut were mainly done with Cuban fillers using different Connecticut wrappers that were being grown in the valley. And we're going to get into those three major varieties in just a second. Okay, so here's the good stuff. So mainly throughout the years, there's three main seed varieties that were grown in the valley. The one to the left you have is the Cuban seed. The middle is your Connecticut broadleaf, and then the infamous Connecticut shade on your right side. These pictures, as you can see, they're a little bit dated. I love old tobacco history. These images come from the Department of Agriculture from the early 1900s. But if you can see, notice the difference between these three tobacco varieties. There's some very distinct differences, as you see, with the Havana seed. Notice the stalk position of how the leaves are growing on the leaf, okay? Look at the broadleaf. You can see from the short stalkiness, the wider leaves, you can see this plant almost looks more like a filler plant. And I'll get into that a little bit more. It's shorter, it's stockier, heavier leaves, and look at the tremendous difference of the Connecticut shade. Much different in the stalk position, in the height of the plant, and we're going to get into those details here in a second. So Cuban seed. We know that Cuban seeds were being traded in the late 1600s, 1700s, and then also in the 1800s, the Department of Agriculture actually started working on enhancing the Cuban seed because there was issues with different diseases in the fields. So in the 1880s, the Department of Agriculture actually started distributing seeds to farmers, and they were working on the seeds to strengthen them instead of using different pesticides or chemicals in the fields. One way is to make the seed stronger and healthier. So they actually worked on this seed. This is where one of the seed varieties called 142, which is, we produce a cigar called Tabernacle 142 Havana seed. One of my favorite sticks. This came from that period of when they really worked on making this stronger in the field, more resistant against disease. What does that do? It makes for a healthier, stronger plant, which in my opinion produces amazing flavor and taste. One thing about the Havana seed from Connecticut, for me, it's one of the most unique seed varieties in the world. It has a tremendous amount of oil, which produces incredible flavor, but it's tremendously difficult to ferment, taking between 2 to 3 years in fermentation piles. Okay, the infamous Connecticut broadleaf. Connecticut broadleaf is actually, from what we know, is a hybridization of a local seed from Connecticut and seeds that came up from Maryland. I'm constantly doing research because I find things change throughout my different research. This is what is pretty much accepted, that Connecticut broadleaf was a seed that was hybridized with a local Connecticut seed and a seed that came from Maryland. And we don't know exactly what the origin of that seed was, but it was brought on because you can see from the leaves, from making smaller cigars, you can get a tremendous amount of yield because of the larger leaves. Unfortunately, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, it's quite a challenge for growing broadleaf because, as I said before, this plant compared to wrapper grade plants, looks and acts more like a filler style tobacco. Filler style tobaccos are shorter, they're stockier, they don't get, very tall. Most wrapper tobaccos, this is not the case. They get much taller, 8 feet, 9 feet, and they're much thinner in the cellular structure of the leaf and the yield. For premium handmade cigars, it is difficult yielding tobacco compared to other wrapper tobaccos. So just to give you an idea, Connecticut Shade between 4 to 6 pounds can yield you 1,000 cigars. With broadleaf, it will take 25 pounds to yield you 1,000 cigars. And we'll also get into some of the challenges in the field. Connecticut Shade, this is an interesting one. So, Connecticut Shade, let me just take a sip here. Connecticut Shade was actually developed in the early 1900s because of pressure coming from sales of Sumatra leaf coming from Dutch tobacco traders. So the Dutch had settled Sumatra, Indonesia. They were growing tobacco in jungles, fields that were cut out, and they were protected by the cover of jungle. So the plants were not getting full sun exposure because of the jungle. That produced a very high yielding, smooth, silky wrapper tobacco. And this was crushing the sales of Connecticut broadleaf and Havana seed in Connecticut. So the Department of Agriculture started working on the development of trying to solve this problem with a new seed variety. So after many years of experimenting, they took Sumatra seed, Cuban seed, and broadleaf and hybridized them together, and this became Connecticut Shade. This is what we know as Connecticut Shade. So this was developed in the early 1900s, and then a brilliant gentleman came up with the idea of mimicking the jungles of Sumatra by covering the fields with cheesecloth tents. This is what we call tapado, right? This was developed in Connecticut in the early 1900s. This is used currently in Cuba for growing all their wrapper tobaccos. It's being used now in Nicaragua. It's used now in many areas that are trying to grow wrapper tobacco. So this cheesecloth tent, it produced a microclimate underneath this tent of a 10% higher humidity, less temperature, less sun exposure, and it produced a beautiful, golden, high-yielding wrapper tobacco. And we'll see, this is here a picture of Connecticut Shade in Windsor. You can imagine the labor that's involved in putting cheesecloth tents on hundreds of acres of fields in the Connecticut River Valley. This is actually a picture of me in Ecuador, and that is Connecticut Shade. So ironically, after many years, Connecticut Shade dominates the valley for 100 years. It becomes one of the most popular wrappers, still is, I think, in the cigar world. At the end of the 90s, at the 80s, the seed was brought down to Ecuador. I had the pleasure of speaking with David Perez from ASP Tobacco actually a couple hours ago. He was one of the first, his father, to bring Connecticut Shade to Ecuador. And from the late 80s until present, Connecticut Shade production in the valley has gone down to almost nothing. So as far as my knowledge, there's no one currently growing shade under shade. There is a lot of experimentation happening in the valley using Connecticut Shade seed, but it's being grown in the sun. A friend of mine, John Foster, is one of the farmers that's leading the way in experimenting. But unfortunately, no experimentation happened, at the end of the 80s when they brought the seed down to Ecuador. So Ecuador is interesting because it has cloud cover during growing season. all the time, okay? This thin layer of clouds. So this acted as the natural shade. So it was not necessary to put cheesecloth tents over the fields. And it took about 5 years to acclimate, and then the seed really started taking in Ecuador, throughout the 90s into the 2000s, and slowly, the production has gone down. The picture here in Ecuador is I'm actually topping the plant. This is what they call desflorado. You might have heard the term. This is one of the only places that I know that actually lets the tobacco flower. Okay, as you can see, those are all tobacco flowers. That's not common. Most tobacco plants are topped around 55, 60 days. The idea is to try to get the energy to go from not producing a flower into the leaves. What's happening here is they actually want it to flower because they want to lose weight. Usually when you let the tobacco flower, it loses about 2% weight per acre. Most people don't want that because they don't want to lower the weights, but in this case, it makes the leaf thinner, which is great for wrapper tobaccos. Let's see. Okay, Connecticut faces a lot of challenges, and the biggest challenge has been weather, okay? We start the growing season in April. That's when the seed beds start. We have been plagued, unfortunately, with a lot of rain over the past 7 years, okay? Last year was the third rainiest growing season on record since they started recording. 5 years ago, it broke the record. So unfortunately, we are starting in April. That's when the seed beds start. It's about 55, 65 days there. Then they're transplanted to the fields. At 55 days, we're topping. In about 65, 70 days, that's when harvest begins. The issue, what we run into is when we get into July and August, okay? The heat builds up. If anybody knows Northeast summers, it does get really hot. And by August, you have a tremendous amount of humidity build up, and you have to go through micro tornadoes, hail, storms, wind. This is not typical for growing cigar tobaccos. Most of the cigar tobaccos that we're smoking are grown in the dry season. So we don't have to face these other Nicaragua. We don't have to face, we couldn't grow tobacco during the rainy season in Nicaragua. You wouldn't have any tobacco left. Unfortunately, we don't have that luxury in Connecticut. We're faced with yield problems. About 3 years ago, 20% of the crop came out, okay? So when you add that to what I was saying before with broadleaf, it's already a style of tobacco that is more a filler binder style plant. You add in the weather conditions, this poses a great challenge when it comes to yield. For this reason, we have certain brands that we make, one being the Tabernacle, which I'll talk about a little bit in a second. We've been forced to kind of allocate these products because we don't have enough. And that's based purely on the amount of tobacco that's coming out of the fields. Now remember, after we get through the curing barns, harvest at 65, 70 days, then we're in the curing barn for another 60 days. That's another big challenge, okay? Curing barns, you can have a beautiful crop in the fields. If you don't know what you're doing in the curing barns or you don't get the right weather, that beautiful crop can become a disaster pretty quickly. So then once that happens, we're shipping in 45 high cube containers, refrigerated, down to Nicaragua. Then it gets sorted and selected based on texture, and then it's going into fermentation for almost 2 years, right? Can you ferment tobacco much quicker? Of course you can. I always compare it to my grandmother's pasta sauce. You know, she's using the freshest ingredients. She's low heat, simmer for 8 hours. Okay, that's one way, pasta sauce. The other way is you can go get a can, pop it off, and throw it on the stove. Completely different experience. That's the same with cigar tobacco, right? Lower temperatures, longer is how you're preserving the essential oils from the leaf, the flavor, and this makes a tremendous difference in the smoking experience. Because what happens is when you turn up those temperatures really high, you're losing the good stuff to the elements. All right, you can get it done quicker. It can burn right. You know, it can look all right, but you're kind of losing a lot of the goodness. Let's see. Okay, another thing in the Connecticut Valley is stalk cutting. So we do not prime tobacco in the Connecticut River Valley. Mainly everything is stalk cut. This is where we harvest the plant right at the stalk. So it's cut right at the base of the stalk. It's left in the field to wilt, depending on the climate, a couple of hours, and then it is hung in the curing barns by the stalk. This is different compared to priming. If a lot of people have heard priming, that's when you're actually removing the bottom 3 leaves, then you're waiting 6 days, you're removing the next 3 leaves until the plant is completely primed. This has benefits in that we feel, especially with broadleaf, you're still getting the nutrients from the stalk system. For me, that helps keep the tobacco really oily. It adds to the flavor, and it also has a bit less handling compared to the priming of tobacco. Priming of Connecticut shade was done, so priming was done in the Connecticut River Valley. Unfortunately now it's become way too expensive, so the practice is, I haven't seen it used in many, many years, unfortunately. You get a free cigar if you know what stalewart means. Anybody? What? I can't hear you.
Oil.
Oil, no, it means strong and steady. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay, so, you know, I started Foundation Cigars in 2015. It was, thank you very much. I had been, thank you. We launched at this show in 2015, so it's very important for us, the PCA. You know, launching the company, it would have been much more economical to be in Florida, definitely from a tax perspective. Most of the cigars come in through Florida, but I felt it really important for the image of Foundation that we represent Connecticut. So we've actually put our office in the heart of the Connecticut River Valley. I've teamed up with my buddy, John Foster, who's here at the show. John Foster is one of the oldest tobacco growers in Connecticut. His family goes back to the late 1600s. So we've built our office right on John's 300-acre field in the heart of the Connecticut River Valley. I thought it was really important, I think, for Connecticut and the industry. You know, as time has gone on, a lot of people, you know, through the 80s have gotten out of the industry and growing, you know, all of the different challenges from a legislative standpoint. You know, we've had challenges, of course, from the FDA. So unfortunately, a few people have gotten out of growing, but John and Foundation have really been, I think, you know, John and I connected because he really sees the vision and the importance of Connecticut, the history of Connecticut, and also investing in the Connecticut River Valley. And we thought it important to carry the torch in the Connecticut River Valley. So this is what we're trying to do. These are some of the brands that use Connecticut tobacco for Foundation's products. We have the Havana seed, which is used on the Tabernacle. The Connecticut broadleaf is used on our Tabernacle Connecticut broadleaf, and also our Charter Oak cigars. Charter Oak is actually the symbol of Connecticut. It is actually also one of the first symbols of American independence. It was actually an oak tree in the heart of the Connecticut River Valley that was used to keep one of the Connecticut charters from the British, to keep the colony's rights. So I wanted to do a brand that really paid homage to all of these Connecticut brands of old. Leading up into the 90s, there was tons of Connecticut brands. Moneymaker, FD Grave, Topstone. Fortunately, Chris Topper from Topper Cigars, he's still making cigars. He has a tremendous history of using Connecticut tobacco, and his family goes back to about 1894, I think. He just told me today he found an old document that went back to 1894. Many of these brands kind of faded into the twilight at the end of the 90s. So I thought it was important to develop a brand that kind of paid homage to these brands of old, and that was our Charter Oak brand. Connecticut shade, unfortunately, there is, as I explained, not much shade being grown in the valley, so most of the Connecticut shade being used on the product is Connecticut seed, but it is being grown in Ecuador. How am I doing on time? All right. So that ends the presentation. I just want to tell a quick story, of where we have our office on Dunn & Foster's farm. I met John Foster in 2003 in a warehouse in the north of Nicaragua. I was walking to a meeting, I think he was walking to a meeting, and it was the two of us meet in the middle of a tobacco warehouse filled with fermentation piles, and he looks at me and I said, "Where are you from?" "Connecticut." "Where are you from?" "Connecticut." And that was the beginning of our relationship. And that was the first time seeing Connecticut broadleaf. I had been in Nicaragua almost a year and a half without being home. And it was the first time that part of my home was there in the north of Nicaragua in a warehouse. I'm looking at tobacco, from mi tierra, from my lands, and there it was in the north of Nicaragua, and that started, really the journey for me. And it's a great honor to be here. I hope I didn't ramble too much. I'd love to open the floor to questions.
We got some microphones over here too.
Hey Nick, my name is Mo. Right in front of you, right in front.
Where are we at?
Hi,
Mo.
How you doing?
I'm good. You?
Good. Two questions. One, are you willing to share your slides? I thought they were phenomenal, great educational tools.
That is a good question.
That would be great.
Mo, we'll have a talk.
Okay. Secondly, will you be giving tours? Will it be open?
So that's a great question. We plan on doing small tours. Mo, unfortunately, we've been so busy. I started Foundation. It was me and one other coworker at the time out of the back of my house. It was actually a post and beam cabin I built, and we've been off to the races, and we're not quite there yet to open up the office to the public, just because we haven't set up the staff yet in order to handle visitors. We're hoping, next year that we can start going. I think the plan is first to open it up to retailers, so cigar shops, and to have cigar shops come. So hopefully one day we can see you up there. Thanks, Mo. Thanks, Samir.
Hello. Nick, first of all.
Where we at?
Right here, right in front of you again.
There you go. These lights are tough.
Yeah, I hear you. First of all, thank you for this presentation. wonderful research.
My pleasure. You
Passion
guys are my
comes
guinea.
from-
This is the first time I've given this presentation, so I appreciate
Yeah.
you bearing with me.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much. My name is Brendan from the Lounge Lizards podcast. First of all, as a group of cigar smokers from the Northeast, can certainly commiserate with the fickleness and frustrations of Northeast weather. There's a lot of reasons why we're here, and happy to be in the Vegas sun. Connecticut Shade, where do you see the growth? Where do you see the demand from both a grower, manufacturer perspective, and also an end smoker palate? Or where do you see the palate maturing in the next 5, 10, 15 years? Where is it placed in this large plethora of strong, rich Nicaraguan tobacco?
Listen, to my knowledge, Connecticut Shade is one of the top selling cigars, by volume. It's interesting that this changeover from Connecticut grown Connecticut Shade to Ecuador, the market didn't really, really buck up too much from the changeover. Connecticut Shade is much thinner leaf. It's got a thinner cellular structure of the leaf. The vein structure is much thinner, and I'm talking in general now. It's much more of a neutral, lighter flavor profile. So when this change started happening to Ecuador, there wasn't, from my opinion, there wasn't a lot of people that stopped smoking Connecticut Shade cigars. I mean, most of you guys are retailers in here. I don't know if you would agree with me, but I would say that is the case. Connecticut Shade, I think, is really strong in Ecuador. It's actually being grown in Nicaragua. I'm not as familiar with the Dominican. I would imagine there's Connecticut Shade seed varieties growing there. I don't think Cuba would tell you this, but you can read old articles from the 90s and 80s that the Cubans have definitely used Connecticut Shade seed to hybridize with their wrapper tobaccos. If you can see sometimes, to me, some of these Cuban wrappers almost look Connecticut Shades of it. You can see them, they're very light. Brandon, I don't know if I'm answering your question. What was the last part of the question? Where do I see the growth? I mean, I think, again, the majority of the cigar smokers, and I'd love to hear this from the shops, I mean, Connecticut Shade is one of the top selling cigars. I think it's different for us in the cigar community. We're all hardcore cigar people. So, a lot of us like the heavier, the rich Nicaraguan fillers, the darker wrappers sometimes, but I think there's still a huge consumer base. I think they're very important for new cigar smokers. New cigar smokers, it's so important to get them the right cigar when they're starting off in cigars. I wouldn't give them a Connecticut broadleaf with a lot of heavy Nicaraguan fillers to start. I would put them on Connecticut Shade. So I think it's very important, the seed variety, for people that like smoother, lighter, less potent cigar blends. I think it's really important. We are experimenting a lot in the Valley with trying to work with the Connecticut Shade seed, different hybridizations to work on a solution for solving this loss of Connecticut Shade growth of this wrapper. If you notice, Connecticut broadleaf and the Cuban seed, because of the nature of those seed varieties, they cannot be replicated the same way as Connecticut Shade, in my opinion. Broadleaf is grown in Pennsylvania. It's being grown in the Caribbean. It's being grown in Honduras, Nicaragua. It's being experienced, but you can't replace this 15,000 years of glacier history that has produced the perfect soil for growing those two seed varieties. Right? They're much heavier. They're much thicker. That, in my opinion, can't be changed. Are these other seed broadleafs grown in other countries bad or worse. I don't see it that way. I don't see tobaccos that way. You know, one's better or worse. They just have different characteristics. For me, nothing can replace that really natural, sweet, earthy Connecticut broadleaf. And same with the Cuban seed. The Cuban seed has, you know, its own spice and natural sweetness to it, and they're, I think, very unique compared to any, you know, tobaccos grown in any other region of the world.
Nick, we got time for at this table.
Thank you, Samir. Oh gosh, I don't know if I want to take. No, I'm kidding.
Hey, Nick.
I wish I could see you. This light is blinding me.
With my size, how do you miss me?
You just look like a dark shadow at this bar. It's the light behind you. So that's all right. I can hear you. So,
Ben Lee from the Cigar Coalition.
what's your name? Ben. Okay, Ben.
So
Ben Lee.
you kind of touched on this earlier, but with the demise of generational family farms, really all over the U.S., how do you see the future of tobacco growing in the Connecticut River Valley? And do you see a revival of the Connecticut shade there as well?
I mean, I think that why this is important, you know, education is important. We need everyone's support. You know, if everybody keeps smoking Connecticut tobaccos, then they're gonna continue to be produced. So that's why I think it's vital, you know, for cigar shops to really learn the challenges that we're facing. Because we are facing a lot of challenges, and we really want to see, you know, U.S. grown tobaccos stay alive and continue into the future. I've dedicated my life to it, you know, since I was 18, you know, working with a lot of great farmers. John Foster is working with tons of farmers in the valley. So it's really in your guys' hands. If you continue to purchase and support Connecticut tobaccos and Connecticut cigars, we'll keep going, Ben Lee. We'll try. All right. Shout out to John. It's his 40th birthday today and his first time at the PCA. Big up, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Make sure you go and check out the Foundation Cigar booth during the trade show. A lot of interesting stuff going on in Connecticut. It's recently, you may have seen the news article that the first cigar bar license was granted in 20 years in Connecticut. So that's some of the work of the PCA advocacy with local partners in Connecticut. We want to keep getting more wins. Very informative session. We're going to take a 10-minute break and return with the annual meeting. The